The stars over Valari Prime were quiet and cold, as always, and the skies above the capital city glowed with soft blue light from the twin moons that hung over the silver towers of the Valari people. The Valari were gentle and peaceful, and they had lived without war for over 1,000 years, and their world was filled with beauty and balance, and soft music played in the air from floating orbs that danced above the gardens of crystal trees. Children played with learning drones while their parents worked in the great sky domes, where energy flowed from clean sources and minds worked on science and knowledge instead of weapons or fear. They had grown wise and powerful in thought, but weak in muscle and fire, and they believed the galaxy had no more monsters left. They were wrong. From deep space came the Drexer Dominion, and they arrived with fire and steel and hunger in their hearts. And their ships were black like the void and shaped like claws, and their weapons were loud and cruel. They did not speak when they came, and they did not send a warning, and they simply arrived and began to burn the outposts on the edge of Valari space. Valari Peace ships tried to speak with them, but the Drexer answered with fire and tore the ships apart and laughed as they broadcast the screams of dying Valari across the void. The Valari government tried to remain calm, and sent messages to the Galactic Council and to nearby systems and to allies from long ago, but none answered and none dared to speak. The Drexer were feared across the stars, and no one wanted to challenge them, and the Valari were now alone. The High Speaker of Valari stood before the Emergency Council, and her voice trembled as she said the words no Valari had spoken in over 1,000 years. She said, "We must send the ancient signal." The others gasped, and some cried, and one even fainted, because the ancient signal was a code of last resort call for help that reached across the stars to anyone and everyone. It was sent only by those who had no hope left and no weapons to fight and no way to run. The code was written in the early days of spaceflight when the Valari feared the darkness and still remembered war. Now that fear had returned. The High Speaker walked to the signal chamber deep beneath the city, where the old machines still waited and where dust lay thick on the panels and the air smelled like memory and fear. She placed her hand on the ancient control, and the machine came alive with soft light and old tones that had not been heard in 1,000 years. The message was short and simple. "This is Valari Prime. We are under attack. We have no weapons. We seek help from any who will listen. Please." They sent the message once, then again, then again. They kept sending it every hour, every minute, every second as the Drexer came closer and the outer colonies began to fall. One by one, the voices of the Valari were silenced, and the stars that once shone bright with trade and light now blinked dark as fire took their place. The Valari gathered in shelters and underground cities, and some still hoped for help, but most began to accept the end. Children asked their parents if the stars would be safe again, and parents lied with tears in their eyes and said, yes, even as they watched the flames grow closer on the hollow maps. Then one day, a signal came back. The room fell silent as the council watched the screen flicker and change, and a new voice spoke in the chamber for the first time. It was deep and cold and calm. The words were simple and few. Earth acknowledges. We have received your signal. Hold position. Help is coming. There was silence in the room for many heartbeats, and then someone whispered, Earth, that death world. Others gasped, and one of the elders stood up and shouted, we cannot trust them. They are violent. They're monsters. They're from a world that kills everything. The Valari had long feared the world called Earth because of the stories they had heard from ancient traders and old warning files that told of storms and fire and beasts and the humans who walked that place. A world where gravity was high and pressure was crushing and storms tore the land apart and fire lived in the ground and lightning ruled the sky. And yet humans had survived there. They had thrived there. They had become stronger than any species should have become. And when they left their world, they did not come with peace. They came with machines of war and ships made of thick metal, and they never asked before acting. The humans had once walked into a civil war between two empires and ended it in one day by destroying both sides and leaving without a word. They were called Deathworlders by the galaxy and feared not just for their strength but for their silence. Now those same humans had answered the Valari's cry. The council argued for hours, and some begged to turn off the signal before it was too late, and others said it was too late already, and no one else had answered. The High Speaker stood again and said only one thing. We called for help. Now we must accept who answered. And so they waited. Days passed, and then weeks, and the Drexer came closer and closer, and now only a few colonies remained, and the maps were almost fully red with enemy symbols. The Valari prepared for the worst. They read stories to their children and lit candles in ancient temples and tried to make peace with the end. Then one day the stars changed. Sensors lit up across the system, and warning lights flashed, and the sky above the capital turned dark as shadows moved across the moonlight. Hundreds of massive ships dropped out of warp space and formed a wall across the sky, and they were not Drexer ships, and they were not Valari ships. They were black with sharp lines and heavy guns and strange markings. They had no flags, no music, no greetings, just silence. Then one ship spoke. A single message was sent in perfect Valari language. This is the Terran Response Fleet. We have received your SOS. We are taking control of this conflict. All Valari forces stand down. Do not interfere. The message ended and no other words came. The Valari watched in fear and hope and confusion as the ships spread across the system and began scanning everything and moving into positions only known to war fleets. The Drexer ships at the edge of the system turned and fled at the sight of the Terran fleet, but it was too late. The humans had seen them, and they never ignored a threat. The Valari whispered in halls and rooms and wondered what would come next. They had called into the dark, and something had answered. Not with kindness, not with comfort, but with cold steel and fire. They had sent an SOS into the galaxy, and Earth had listened. Now the war would change forever, and the galaxy would never forget what happened when a death world answered the call. The galaxy was not silent when Earth answered the SOS, but it did not speak with words or signals or speeches. It whispered in fear and memory, and old warnings that echoed in the minds of those who remembered the last time the Death Worlders moved across the stars. In distant sectors where leaders drank sweet nectar and watched the news from safe stations, many stood from their chairs and froze when the Terran Response Fleet was seen above Valari Prime, because they knew that humans never sent a response unless they were truly serious, and when they were serious, stars often burned. The Drexer did not run, but they did slow, and they did wonder, and they did begin to question if the soft world they had chosen to consume had suddenly grown teeth and claws and rage. Inside the Valari Council chambers, leaders debated in hushed tones, and worried looks filled the room, while maps shifted and Terran ships kept arriving one after another until the system was wrapped in rings of firepower and metal. The High Speaker sat in silence while others argued, and she thought about the message Earth had sent and how it was not an offer of help or a kind reply or a message of friendship, but a command to claim and a warning all in one voice. Some in the council wanted to cancel the SOS and tell Earth to leave, but the technical team said it was impossible. Once a Terran fleet locks onto a distress signal, it does not stop until the threat is removed or destroyed, and sometimes it does not stop even then. A historian in the room spoke softly and said he once studied an old case where Earth answered a similar signal and within days had changed the structure of a moon and vaporized half a fleet from orbit without saying a word and left without taking spoils or making claims. The room fell quiet, and the truth became clear to all that Earth was not coming to help out of kindness or pity, but because something in their cold logic told them that a cry for help must be answered with force, and that force must be absolute. Outside, the planet's surface shadows moved across the twin moons, and the sky was filled with the hum of distant engines and the quiet whine of machines, so advanced they seemed alive, and the Valari people stepped out of their homes to look up with wide eyes and soft hands clutching each other in fear and wonder. Children asked their parents who the humans were, and some parents said they were monsters, and others said they were protectors, and a few simply said they're the ones who live on a world where everything tries to kill them, and they survived. The Valari were not warriors, and they never wanted to be, but now their lives were in the hands of those who were born in war and raised in fire and shaped by storms and blood and gravity. From the orbit above, the command ship of the Terran fleet floated like a dark god, and deep inside it a figure stood tall in a metal room with glowing walls and cold light. He was called Commander Rain, and his voice was sharp and low, and his eyes were like steel frozen in time, and his mind moved like a machine that knew no fear and no pause. He watched the data stream across the panels and saw the shape of the Drexer fleet moving through the edge of the system, and he gave orders without emotion, without hesitation, without delay. He said identify targets, calculate risk, deploy scouts, monitor planetary shields, and prepare orbital fire if resistance is met. Beside him stood an officer with silver skin and cybernetic implants that flickered as she spoke, and she said, "Commander, the Volari have no weapons, they are not a threat." And Rain replied, "They are not our concern." The officer said, "But they're the ones who sent the signal." Rain turned slowly and said, "That is why we are here," they cried, "and we answer." And then he turned back to the screen and raised a hand, and the fleet began to move. The Drexer saw them come and laughed at first because their ships were many and their weapons were sharp and their soldiers were bred for pain, but the laughter began to fade when the Terran fleet did not stop and did not speak and did not hesitate. One by one, scout ships entered Drexer space and sent back maps, images, data, and weak points, and Commander Rain studied them all in silence as his officers prepared the fire grid and the ground assault units. On Volari Prime, alarms began to ring and voices shouted in the streets as the planetary news showed Terran ships deploying drones and tanks and walker units that hovered above the ground like ghosts of war. Volari scientists begged the Council to speak with Earth, but the message that came back from the Terran fleet was always the same. Hold position. Do not interfere. This is a human operation now. The Volari were not prisoners, but they were not in control, and they began to realize that calling for help from Earth was like asking a thunderstorm to protect a flower. You might be safe, but everything around you will be changed. In the outer colonies where Volari settlers still tried to hold their homes, Drexer raiders continued their attacks, and fires burned, and cries were heard in the darkness, and hope faded fast. But then in one sector, the fire stopped, because a single Terran frigate appeared without warning and without light, and destroyed 5 Drexer warships in less than 10 minutes, and sent a message on open comms that said this is the first warning. The Drexer laughed again, but with less voice and more worry. Another Terran ship appeared in another colony, and again the Drexer were wiped away in minutes, and again the same message was sent, this is the first warning. The Drexer commanders met in secret and asked what these warnings meant, and one of them said, "What if there is no second warning?" Back on Volari Prime, the people watched the stars, and some began to light candles and offer songs to the Terran fleet as if it were a god or a storm or a force too big to understand. In the council chambers, the high speaker watched the sky and whispered to herself, "Not all monsters come to destroy, some come to keep worse monsters away." In orbit, the Terran fleet finished its first phase and began moving into full combat readiness, and the weapons charged, and the soldiers prepared, and the mechs began to rise from the lower decks. Commander Rain stood before his officers and said, "The Volari are under protection now. The Drexer violated peace. The Drexer will be silenced." A young officer asked him, "Sir, what if the Drexer surrender?" Rain did not blink and said they had their chance when they fired the first shot. And so the humans prepared. No grand speeches, no songs, no banners, just purpose, just action, just silence. And across the galaxy, eyes turned to Volari Prime. And some felt fear, some felt hope, but all knew that something had changed, because the humans had arrived, and they did not come with promises. They came with power, and the Volari had called for help, and now the help had arrived, not in the way they expected, but in the way that worked. The light above Volari Prime shifted into a strange golden hue as massive shadows floated through the sky, and the clouds moved in unnatural patterns as if pushed aside by something older and stronger than weather, and the people on the surface stood in silence with their eyes raised high and their hearts pounding in their chests. A wave of sound moved across the cities like a slow drumbeat, deep and low and powerful, and it was not thunder, it was the sound of engines that had never touched this part of space before, engines that carried stories of old wars and ancient power and unspoken fear. The Terran fleet was here, now fully here, with its massive carriers and sharp-edged cruisers and black-armored warships that looked like moving mountains of steel and energy and silence. From the clouds descended 3 dreadnoughts with hulls darker than space and covered in glowing red lines that pulsed like veins, and each of them moved with the grace of giants who knew no fear and no hesitation. The lead ship was called Vindicator, and it carried the symbol of a broken sword and a single word written in Terran script, and that word meant vengeance in a language not spoken by the Valari, but understood all the same. In the capital city, the Valari gathered in the central square to watch the strange shapes take formation above their skies, and some held their children close, while others knelt in the soft grass and sang old songs meant to bring calm in times of fear. The sky cracked open for a moment, and a line of light stretched from the lead ship to the atmosphere as a dropship began its descent, moving faster than anything the Valari had ever seen and burning bright as it tore through layers of air like a spear thrown by a god. It slowed only at the last second and hovered above the ground before gently lowering itself onto the landing pad near the Grand Archive, where scholars once taught about stars that no longer shone. A door opened on the side of the dropship, and out stepped 3 figures in armor that shimmered with faint blue light and carried no symbols, no rank, and no flags. They were human, but not like the humans the Valari had seen in ancient records or heard about in the quiet halls of research. They were taller, stronger, colder, and more still than any being should be. The first wore a helmet shaped like a wolf skull with glowing red eyes and carried a weapon that buzzed softly with contained energy and danger. The second wore no helmet, but had silver implants along his jaw, and his arms moved like machines made of flesh and steel. The third wore robes over her armor and held a small device in one hand that projected holograms and strange signals into the air as she walked with slow, careful steps. The Valari delegation arrived with shaking hands and wide eyes and soft voices that barely held together as they approached the 3 warriors and bowed low in greeting. The human with the wolf helmet said nothing. The one with the silver implants stepped forward and said, "We are here on behalf of the Terran Response Fleet. Your signal was received. Your danger is acknowledged. Your survival is now our responsibility." The High Speaker herself stood at the front of the Valari and said, "We welcome you and thank you, and we ask only that you protect our people from those who wish us harm." The human replied, "The Drexer Dominion will not harm you again." No more words were exchanged, and the humans turned and walked back to their ship, while the Valari stood in place with confusion and a growing sense that something much larger than themselves was now in motion. Up in orbit, the Terran fleet began a full system scan, and their satellites deployed in perfect circles around Valari Prime, each one sending pulses into space and drawing invisible lines between planets and moons and debris fields. 1,000 tiny machines flew from the ships and began to repair old satellites and disable Drexer tracking devices and map every inch of the local sector with frightening speed and detail. The Vindicator opened its hangars and began launching squadrons of fighters that moved in tight formations like flocks of deadly birds, and the Drexer scouts, watching from distant sensors, started sending urgent messages back to their fleet leaders. Commander Rain stood in the command deck with his hands behind his back and his eyes focused on the enemy fleet markers that blinked red on his tactical map, and one by one those markers began to move away from Valari space as the Drexer began their retreat. They were not fools, and they knew what it meant when Earth arrived in force and silence and without negotiation. They had seen it before. Once the Terrans decided something was a threat, they did not argue, they did not parley, they did not explain. They simply removed the threat completely and efficiently, and then vanished again into the void. On the surface, the Valari watched as more dropships arrived this time, bringing strange machines and tools and personnel that moved with purpose and clarity. Mobile defense platforms were built in hours, and armored structures rose from the ground as if summoned by invisible hands, and drones flew in perfect lines overhead, mapping the land and preparing for possible breach points. The Valari scientists were amazed and terrified by the speed and precision of human engineering, and some asked the Terrans if they would share their knowledge, but no answers came. Only silence and work and motion. One Valari child watched from a hill as a human mech walker stepped over a ridge and scanned the land with glowing eyes, and he asked his mother, "Is that a soldier or a god?" His mother did not answer, because she did not know. The Valari news networks tried to explain the arrival to the public, but most people already understood at a deep level that could not be spoken that their fate had changed forever the moment Earth heard their cry. In a quiet moment, the High Speaker looked out from her chamber and saw the Terran ships hovering in the upper sky like silent guardians, and she whispered to herself, "They do not come to save, they come to end things." That night, across the world, people lit candles and watched the sky and sang soft songs that once belonged to old myths and stories now reborn in the face of a truth greater than legend. Earth had come. Earth was watching. Earth was waiting. And the Drexer had no idea what was coming. The morning sky over Valari Prime did not carry the same warmth it once had, and though the twin suns still rose and spread golden light across the land, there was now a chill in the air not from wind or weather, but from something deeper, an unseen something that moved through every whisper and glance and silence. The human fleet did not rest, it did not pause, it did not wait. And above the sky, more ships continued to arrive and join the great formation in orbit, each one shaped like a blade or a hammer or a shield built not for beauty, but for purpose. Valari scientists tried to study the Terran designs, but their sensors could not read half of what the human ships did, and their scanners often returned with errors or block signals, as if the Terran machines had minds of their own and chose what to reveal and what to hide. In the capital city, more landing zones were cleared and secured, and more Terran dropships arrived, each carrying supplies, weapons, machines, and soldiers, and the Valari watched them from a distance, unsure whether to feel safe or afraid. The Terran soldiers moved in silence, never speaking unless needed, and never slowing their pace, each one fully armored from head to toe, with visors that glowed faint red and boots that made no sound on the soft stone streets. They built command posts and defense grids and shield walls, and each task was completed with speed and precision that the Valari found almost unnatural, as if the humans were following blueprints that came from the future. In one section of the city, a group of human engineers deployed something that looked like a metal seed, and within hours it unfolded into a full command tower with walls and sensors and communication arrays, all humming with quiet power. Inside the tower, Commander Rain stood before a large map of the system displayed in holographic light, and next to him stood officers and analysts who spoke in short clipped sentences filled with codes and numbers and vectors. The map showed every Drexer fleet movement, every satellite, every patrol, and even guessed their fuel supply routes and fallback positions, and Rain nodded slowly as each detail was confirmed and locked into the system. He gave orders in short bursts: engage stealth recon teams, deploy orbital drones, prepare kinetic strikes, load gravity, rounds armed defense satellites, encrypt all comms with Level 9 protocol. The officers moved without question, and the entire room pulsed with energy and purpose, as if war itself had taken root in the very walls. Outside the tower, the Valari Council tried, once again, to request a meeting with the human command, hoping to ask for cooperation, coordination, and perhaps even understanding, but the reply came quickly and without emotion. Do not interfere. We are here to neutralize the threat. That is all. The Valari understood then that this was no alliance and no friendship. This was a wall of fire placed between them and their enemies, and that wall answered to no one except itself. In a quiet meeting chamber, the High Speaker met with her closest advisors and asked them, "What we have done, have we traded one danger for another? Have we called something we cannot ever send away?" The advisors gave no clear answer, for none knew what Earth truly wanted, only that it had come, and it was preparing for something big, something final. In the outer system, Terran scout ships flew silently through asteroid belts and dark space, hiding from sensors and watching Drexer movements with perfect precision, and when one Drexer ship moved too close, it vanished from every screen without sound or warning, and no one spoke of it again. The Drexer began to notice the silence in their systems, the strange absence of signals, and the sudden cold that came whenever they tried to scan near Valari space, and some captains grew afraid and began to pull back. One Drexer commander named Hurok sent a message to his superiors saying, "We must not attack, we must leave this world at once. These humans are not what we thought." But the Drexer leadership refused to listen. They believed strength was shown by action, and that fear was weakness, and so they sent more ships forward to test the line. Back on Valari Prime, the humans finished deploying the sky barrier, a network of floating defense spheres that hovered high in the atmosphere and connected through invisible beams of energy, each one capable of tracking and destroying targets in seconds. Valari citizens watched the glowing web above their world and wondered what it meant to live beneath such power and whether they would ever see their skies without metal again. Some began to fear the Terrans would stay forever and that they had traded the Drexer invasion for Terran control, but others believed that if Earth wanted to conquer them, they would have already done so. In a small garden near the edge of the city, a Valari elder sat with a young child and pointed to the sky and said, "Once we looked to the stars and dreamed of peace, now we look to them and pray for silence." The child asked, "Are the humans good?" The elder did not answer. In orbit, the Terran command finished all preparations and activated the final phase of deployment, which they called Shield Fallen Aim, that did not comfort the Valari, who had no idea what it meant. Massive cylinders were dropped from orbit into the deep oceans and deserts of the planet, and each one opened to reveal automated structures that began to build new defenses underground and within mountains and beneath the sea. Within hours, the entire planet was covered in invisible walls of energy and tracking arrays and heat signatures that watched the sky, the ground, and even the vacuum of space with perfect awareness. Commander Rain stood before his final report and read each line with a still face and said, "Begin Phase 2, all units move to combat readiness." And so the Terran fleet grew silent once more. Not from sleep, not from rest, but from focus. The kind of silence that only comes before the storm. The Valari felt it in their bones. They had asked for help, and Earth had answered, not with promises, not with kindness, but with war. And now that war was ready, and the enemy had no idea what waited for them in the dark. The stars above Valari Prime were calm the night before the war began, and the moons cast soft silver light across the towers and trees, as if the sky itself did not know that everything was about to change. Birds flew silently in the high clouds, and the wind whispered through the crystal gardens, while children slept in their beds, unaware that death and fire were gathering just beyond the edge of sight. The humans did not sleep. The Terran fleet above the planet moved like a storm trapped in a cage, and every ship glowed faintly with energy as final checks were made, and weapons were armed, and pilots stepped into machines that were shaped like fear itself. Inside the command center of the flagship, Vindicator Commander Rain stood before the large holomap and watched the red marks appear along the outer system edge as the Drexer fleet finally arrived in force. They came in waves, black ships with cruel shapes and glowing engines and loud signals that echoed across the stars like howls from beasts hungry for blood and conquest. They brought carriers, destroyers, swarmers, and siege units with weapons that had ended worlds before, and they came with the belief that no one could stop them, that no force would dare stand in their way. They did not understand Earth. They did not understand what the humans were. They would learn. Commander Rain raised his hand and said 4 words that no one else heard, but every Terran soldier felt in their bones. Execute Strike Plan Theta 6. The first attack was silent. A line of light appeared in the darkness between 2 moons, and then a Drexer carrier simply vanished as its matter collapsed into itself, and its crew was lost without a scream, without a sound, without even a flame. The Drexer panicked and began to fire wildly into the void, but their shots hit nothing but silence and shadows as the Terran fleet moved with speed that defied tracking and weapons that had no name in Drexer language. The second wave of Terran ships dropped from stealth and opened fire with rail cannons that tore holes through shields and armor and bodies, and the stars lit up with flashes of red and blue and silver as the battle began in full. On Valari Prime, the people watched from shelters and rooftops as the sky became a painting of light and motion and noise, and many wept not from fear, but from awe at the sight of a power so great that it seemed to reshape the very heavens. The Terran ships fought like wolves in formation, fast, coordinated, deadly, and their soldiers moved with perfect timing as boarding pods slammed into Drexer hulls and spilled warriors into corridors where they fought in silence with blades and guns and fury. The Drexer screamed and bled and died, and for the first time in centuries they knew fear not from a stronger enemy, but from one that did not pause, did not speak, and did not care for anything but the mission. Down below, the Valari Council gathered in the Great Hall and watched live feeds of the battle as human drones marked enemy ships and eliminated them one by one like names being scratched off a list. The High Speaker asked if any Valari had been harmed, and the answer came quickly: no. The Terrans had built walls and shields and defense nets so thick that not a single Drexer blast had touched the planet. Then she asked what happens if the humans win. No one answered, because no one knew what humans did after victory. Back in orbit, a Terran heavy cruiser called Hammerfall took a direct hit from 3 Drexer torpedoes, and instead of retreating, it turned and rammed a Drexer battleship in return, tearing both ships apart in a flash of white light that turned night into day for 3 seconds. Terran fighters weaved through enemy lines like arrows fired by gods, and their weapons struck engines and reactors and bridges with precision that came from 1,000 battles fought and studied and mastered. On one Drexer ship, a soldier ran through a burning hall and shouted into his comms, asking where the enemy was, and the only reply he got was the sound of his own breath as a human blade slid through his chest from the shadows. The Terrans did not take prisoners. They did not celebrate. They did not gloat. They ended threats, and then they moved on. In a hidden corner of the system, the Drexer High Command watched the battle fall apart, and one of the leaders shouted that this is not possible, that humans are supposed to be primitive, that this is a trick. Another replied, this is not a trick, this is punishment. By the end of the first hour, the Drexer had lost 1/3 of their fleet, and by the end of the second hour, they had lost half and began to retreat. But the Terrans did not allow retreat. Terran gravity wells locked down jump points, and Terran cruisers followed them into dark space and turned them into dust and memory. In the last hour, the final Drexer ship tried to run and sent a signal of surrender across all channels. The Terrans heard it and destroyed the ship anyway. The sky above Valari Prime turned quiet again as the last explosions faded and the stars returned to their usual calm, as if nothing had happened, as if the heavens had simply stretched and yawned. The Terran fleet regrouped and took no damage reports and issued no victory speech and sent no message of success. Instead, they returned to formation and began scanning for survivors, not to help, but to eliminate any remaining enemy who might return one day. On the surface, the Valari stood outside and looked up and knew that the war was over, not because someone had told them, but because they could feel it in the silence that followed the storm. The High Speaker stood before her people and spoke into the public network and said, the Drexer are gone, and we did not save ourselves, but we are still here because someone else chose to act when no one else did. She said, we asked the galaxy for help, and the galaxy turned away, but Earth did not. She said they came not for glory or gold or honor, but for something we still do not understand, and maybe we never will. And above her words, the black ships of Earth hovered in stillness like sentinels of something deeper than war. They had come. They had fought. They had won. And now they waited, not for thanks, not for reward, but for the final word from their commander. And that word had not yet come. The stars above Valari Prime no longer danced with light from war, and the skies that once burned with Terran fire now rested in silence, while the black ships of Earth remained in orbit, still watching, still scanning, still waiting. Across the planet, the people of Valari stepped out from their shelters and homes and tunnels and saw the sky again for the first time in many days, and they saw not fire, not smoke, not fear, but calm and clouds and silence. Children ran through gardens and streets with wide eyes and laughter that broke the long quiet, while their parents stood still and looked up and whispered thanks to no God in particular, but to something bigger than them, something they could not name. In the capital city, the High Speaker walked through the Grand Hall, now filled with light again, and saw her people gathering and hugging and singing songs of survival and peace, though none could forget the price of that peace. On screens across the planet, footage from the battle played on loops, showing ships exploding and Drexer war cries fading in a void, and the silent, cold wrath of the Terran fleet cutting through enemies with precision and no mercy. Some Valari turned off their screens, unable to watch anymore, while others watched in awe, replaying the same moments again and again, trying to understand how humans moved so fast, fought so hard, destroyed so easily. At the Grand Archive, scholars met in silence and spoke in whispers about what Earth truly was and what it meant that such power had been sleeping so close in the stars without anyone knowing what waited beneath that blue and green surface. A young scholar stood and said, maybe the humans are not monsters. Maybe there's something worse, something we do not have words for, something that acts not for love or hate, but because it must. Another replied, maybe they're what happens when a species learns to live on a world that wants them dead every day. Maybe they're what happens when fire and pain become normal. In the orbit above the command ship, Vindicator remained quiet but alive, and inside it, Commander Rain stood before a new map, now free of red markers, now calm, now clean, and his face showed no pride, no joy, no peace, only the same cold focus that had guided every order, every strike, every choice. His officer asked, "Sir, what are your final orders?" He answered, "Scan for survivors, no response is to be accepted, no movement is to be ignored, no signal is to be missed." The officer nodded and left the room, and Rain remained alone, watching the stars, watching the quiet, wondering if quiet ever truly lasted. On Valari Prime, the council gathered to decide what came next, and many voices filled the chamber with questions and fears and hopes. What if the humans stay? What if they never leave? What if we have become a protectorate? What if we are free? The High Speaker listened and said, "We do not ask Earth what it wants. Earth does what it decides, and we must find our place in the shadow it leaves behind." Messages from nearby systems began to arrive, and though no help had come during the crisis, now words of concern and offers of support flooded the Valari networks, and many citizens scoffed at the sudden kindness from those who had once turned away. One message from the Galactic Council said, "We are glad to see you safe, and we welcome Earth's action, though we advise caution as humans are not well understood." The High Speaker replied, "We understand them well enough. They act. When others speak, they fight. When others flee, they end. When others pause." Far from Valari, in a hidden station deep in neutral space, Drexer survivors held secret talks with their leaders, and the voices were loud and angry and afraid, and one general shouted, "We lost everything. We had no chance. We were hunted like prey." Another said, "They came with no emotion. They came like a machine that only knew how to destroy. They are not soldiers. They are not warriors. They are force given shape." An old commander said, "We should never have touched Valari. We should never have answered that signal. We should never have tested the Death Worlders. They called for help, and the humans answered, and now we are ghosts." Back on Valari, children returned to school, and adults returned to work, but everything was different. Every smile held a shadow, and every step carried weight, because everyone knew the truth. Peace had returned not by hope, not by talk, not by law, but by the will of something stronger than fear. In a small town near the sea, a boy built a small model of a Terran ship from scrap and placed it on a high shelf and lit a candle beside it. And when asked why, he said, "They came when no one else did. They stopped the monsters." His grandmother held him close and whispered, "Yes, child, but never forget they are monsters too, just different ones." At the Terran command post outside the capital, human engineers began to dismantle structures and recall drones and pack machines into transport units, while others checked systems and confirmed that all enemy traces were gone. No ceremony was planned, no flags were raised, no music played. Earth had finished its task. Commander Rain stood before his fleet and sent a single message to the Valari government. Threat neutralized. System secured. Departure begins in 30 hours. The message ended and no reply came, because the Valari had no words that felt right, no sentence that matched what they felt, no thank you that sounded true. Instead, they watched the sky and waited as the ships that had come like wrath now began to turn in silence and disappear into the dark one by one like shadows pulling back from the light. The Vindicator was the last to leave, and as it rose higher into the black sky, a small group of Valari gathered in the garden below and raised their hands in silent salute, not in command, not in fear, but in quiet respect. Above them, Commander Rain watched through the glass, and for 1 second his eyes softened, and he said nothing. Then he turned away. The fleet was gone. The war was over. The stars were quiet again. But the galaxy would remember. Because when Valari called for help, Earth answered. And everything changed. The stars above Valari Prime were still and cold, as if watching from a distance, afraid to speak, as if the galaxy itself held its breath, unsure of what might come next after all that had happened. The Terran fleet was gone, but its presence lingered in the air and the ground, in the silence between each word spoken by those who had seen the sky burn and the void open and death fall like rain, without warning and without pause. The cities had returned to life, the schools had reopened, the towers stood tall again, and the people walked the streets with heads high, but in their eyes was something new, something quiet, and heavy, something that whispered, remember. Every Valari child now learned the story of the day the Drexer came, and the day Earth answered, not as a fairy tale, not as a lesson, but as truth carved into history with steel and fire and blood. In the Grand Archive, a new wing was built lined with records and memories of the Terran arrival, not to praise, not to blame, but to remember, to hold on to what was real and terrifying and strange. There were no statues of humans, no golden flags, no songs written in their name, only silence and quiet respect and a deep understanding that power does not ask for recognition and true strength leaves behind no crown. The High Speaker stood before the council and said, these words must never be forgotten. We live today because something darker than our fear chose to fight for us, and that choice must never be taken for granted. In her hand, she held a small shard of metal, once part of a Terran drone, now silent, now cold, and she placed it in the Hall of Memory beneath the light of the twin moons and said, this is not a trophy, this is a warning. Messages came from distant systems asking for truth, for answers, for stories, and the Valari told them, not in anger, not in pride, but with calm voices and steady hearts. They told them Earth did not come with kindness, Earth did not come with love, Earth came with purpose, Earth came with fire, and Earth left without asking for anything, because Earth did not care for reward, Earth cared only that the call was real. In deep space, on a quiet station, a Drexer exile carved words into the metal walls with shaking hands and tired eyes, and those words were not for glory, not for revenge, not for anger. They were a message, they were a plea, they were a lesson. They wrote, if you hear the humans are coming, do not wait, do not fight, do not speak, just run. In the great markets of the Central Systems, traders now speak with lowered voices when the topic of Earth arises, and they say nothing foolish because everyone knows now that Earth listens, and Earth remembers, and Earth arrives when least expected. One merchant said, they do not send diplomats, they send fleets. Another replied, they do not send answers, they send silence and fire. And in every quiet corner of the galaxy, someone is whispering about Valari Prime and the signal that was heard and the wrath that followed. On Valari, the Sky Watchers build a new station on the far side of the moon, not for defense, not for research, but for one single purpose, to send one signal, each cycle a signal, with 5 simple words repeated in all languages across all known frequencies. We remember what you did. That signal reaches deep into the void, across systems, across borders, across time. And though the Terrans never reply, everyone knows they hear it. They always hear. In a remote mountain village, a Valari child asked her elder, why did the humans help us? Why did they come? And the elder looked into the sky and said, maybe they heard something in our voice. Maybe they saw something in our fear. Maybe they came because they're the only ones who understand what it feels like to be hunted. And the child asked, will they ever come back? The elder said, not if we're lucky, not if we are careful, not if we never call again. In the ruins of the Drexer Dominion, broken fleets drift through space, forgotten, silent, dead, and untouched by salvage crews and scavengers, because no one dares approach them, not out of respect, not out of value, but because the ghosts of that war still live there. Stories say some wrecks still glow with heat from Terran weapons, and that machines from Earth still float nearby, scanning, waiting, watching. No one goes near. No one wants to. The Galactic Council met in secret after the war, and spoke long and carefully about Earth and its power and its silence and its decision to act without permission, without law, without fear. Some said they are a danger, some said they are a gift, some said they are both, and none were wrong. A vote was taken, and the result was clear. Earth would not be challenged, Earth would not be summoned, Earth would not be provoked. From that day forward, a law was written, though not spoken aloud, a law that lived in every council chamber and command room and whispering voice across the stars. Do not test the Death Worlders. They live in a place where the sky burns, the land shakes, the wind kills, and the sea swallows, and still they rise, and still they grow, and still they walk forward. They do not fear pain, they do not fear loss, they do not fear war. They're the answer that comes when hope fails. They're the hand that reaches from the fire and pulls down the stars. And when they come, they do not stop. On Valari Prime, a new generation grows up under peaceful skies and learns the names of flowers and stars and machines and warships. And among them are those who look up at night and dream of becoming more not warriors, not leaders, but witnesses. Witnesses to what once was, to what saved them, to what changed the galaxy forever. In time, the Terran fleet became a myth, a story, a warning told in every language, from the cold moons of the border world to the shining cities of the inner core. But on one quiet night, in a silent chamber on Valari Prime, the signal tower blinked with a soft blue light, just once, just for a second. A message came through, short and simple, with no location, no name, no origin. It said, "We are still here.